Christopher Dawson was one of the greatest Catholic historians of the 20th century. Dawson, like Chesterton, was a convert. He was also, like Chesterton, a powerful advocate for cultural and spiritual renewal in the face of growing secularity and the religious decline. An eloquent champion of the need for Europe to rediscover its Christian roots, he played an influential role in Catholic educational thinking on both sides of the Atlantic, but especially in the United States. A scholar of extraordinary range and variety, Dawson's work was animated by one key principle: the importance of religion as a massive, objective, unquestioned power that entered into everything and left its mark on the external as well as the internal world. In this online conference, Dermot Quinn, Joseph Stewart, and David Bonagura will reflect on Dawson's life and legacy and consider his contribution to the Catholic intellectual tradition, a tradition he helped to shape and redefine. I am now pleased to introduce to you our speakers. David Bonagura is a teacher at St. Regis High School in New York and is an adjunct professor at St. Joseph's Seminary and Catholic Distance University. He is the author of Steadfast in Faith and Staying with the Catholic Church, and the translator of Jerome Steers' Letters to Friends in Mourning. Dr. Dermot Quinn is a professor of history at Seton Hall University and editor of the Chesterton Review. He was educated at Trinity College Dublin and New College, Oxford, where he was awarded a doctorate in 1986. He has written extensively on Chestertonian themes and has authored a number of books. His latest book is Seton Hall University, 1856 to 2006, A History. He also has written many articles and reviews in the field of British and Irish history. Dr. Joseph Stewart teaches in the History and Catholic Studies program at the University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota. His monograph, Christopher Dawson, A Cultural Mind in the Age of the Great War, was published to great acclaim by the Catholic University in 2022. After the conversation segment, we will have a Q&A period. If you have any questions, kindly post them in the chat function. If due to time we're not able to answer your questions, please send them by email to chestertoninstitute@shu.edu, indicating who the questions are or is directed to. I now leave you with our speakers, Dr. Joseph Stewart, David Bonagura, and Dr. Dermot Quinn. Welcome. Dermot.
Well, thank you very much, Gloria, for that wonderful and kind introduction, which anticipates some of the things that I'm going to say about Christopher Dawson. It's good to spend some time together talking about Christopher Dawson and the Catholic intellectual tradition. It's particularly good to have that conversation with two scholars who have done much to amplify our understanding of Dawson and to refresh his legacy for future generations. Finally, and rather shamelessly, it's good to be able to promote the latest issue of the Chesterton Review, which is devoted to Dawson and which is conceived as a kind of celebration, I think, of Professor Stewart's recent excellent monograph on him. In some ways, however, the fact that we are having a conversation at all is kind of miraculous. When Dawson died in 1970 at the age of 80, the Cambridge medievalist David Knowles doubted if anyone under the age of 40 would remember him. He was yesterday's man, a figure from a rapidly disappearing past. Knowles captured him deftly. His slight figure, his gentle voice, his frail appearance, his weak health, his retiring disposition. A man so insubstantial that a gust of wind might sweep him out of sight. As if to suggest, Knowles, as if to suggest in the descriptors the ephemerality of the reputation. Yet to those who came of age in the 1920s and 1930s, Knowles insisted, Dawson was a sage. His vast scholarship, his mind always taking the broadest view of history and religion, his awareness of culture as freighted with spiritual significance, his Augustinian sense of a living past whose story is not complete, his understanding of Europe as a transmitter of the Christian and classical civilizations from which it was formed, his moral seriousness, his courageous defense of political freedom in the face of totalitarianism. These were Dawson's legacies to his own and later generations. Well, in the years immediately after his death, Dawson did indeed fade from view. In more recent years, however, a Dawson revival has been encouragingly underway. Years ago, John Malloy kept his name before the public in the form of the Dawson newsletter. Latterly, Don Breel, Glenn Olson, Russell Hittinger, Gerald Rossello, Bradley Berzer, Adam Swartz, who I think may even be with us, Adam Swartz and James Lothian have taken up the baton. Sadly, Don Breel and Gerald Rossello are no longer with us, but they did much to reinvigorate interest in Dawson, not simply as a writer, but as a practical model of the Catholic intellectual life. Students who travel to Rome with Catholic studies professors walk in Dawson's trail, but also, I think, in theirs. Now, in the second or third wave of this Dawson revival, we have Professor Stewart's splendid Christopher Dawson, A Cultural Mind in the Age of the Great War. What Professor Stewart identifies and admires in Dawson, the architectural way he arranges discrete historical and philosophical materials, the boundary thinking by which he protects the integrity of distinct disciplines, the bridge building by which he encourages conversations between disciplines, the intellectual asceticism with which he conducted his scholarly life, I think all of these virtues are amply displayed in Professor Stewart's book. Yet, what precisely is being revived, and what does it have to do with the Catholic intellectual tradition? To state the obvious, and as Gloria reminded us, to state the obvious, Christopher Dawson was an historian of extraordinary breadth and depth. But he never saw himself as merely the excavator of an interesting but otherwise lifeless past. Whatever the past was, even the most distant past, it was not finished. Dawson gave material culture its due, but always insisted on the spiritual impulses that lay behind it, offering a sacramental reading of history that saw deeper truths incarnating themselves in the materiality of the ordinary and the everyday. Even as a boy, he could sense the importance of religion in human life, to quote the phrase that Gloria quoted, as a massive, objective, unquestioned power that entered into everything and impressed its mark on the external as well as internal world. To understand that massive objective power, to see its uses and abuses, to reveal its range, well, that was his life's work. What is being revived, in other words, is a sensibility or vision. Dawson's major works remain important and ought to be on serious reading lists. I think the intellectual journalism of the 1930s and 40s is necessarily time limited and dated. But whether in a major or minor key, what is most striking about Dawson, I think, is his combination of daring and restraint. His scholarly scrupulosity as an end in itself, as Professor Stewart points out, but also at the service of a grander imaginative scheme. Always in his work is a sense of the creative interactions between religion and culture, between past and present, between man and his environment, between the material and the spiritual. He's an intensely liminal thinker, I think, fascinated by thresholds. And that's one way I think of thinking about him. History, he said, is not to be explained as a closed order in which each stage is the inevitable and logical result of that which has gone before. In an unsettling way, history is not to be explained at all. There's an irreducibly mysterious element to the human drama that defies the best and worst of the system builders. Well, this may be as much a theological as an historical claim. So be it. Dawson was a Catholic historian, after all. He can hardly be required to cease to be Catholic simply to please the positivists. Religion is the key to history, he wrote in 1948. We cannot understand the inner form of a society unless we understand its religion. We cannot understand its cultural achievements unless we understand the religious beliefs that lie behind them. In all ages, the first creative works of a culture are due to a religious inspiration and dedicated to a religious end. Chesterton, I think, said much the same thing in The Everlasting Man. Man, to quote Chesterton, man found it natural to worship. He not only felt freer when he bent, he actually felt taller when he bowed. Anything that took away the gesture of worship would stunt and even maim him forever. In so declaring, both men were attempting to describe that Augustinian restlessness for the divine that is the stamp of all human beings. The search can go spectacularly wrong, as it did in both their lifetimes, when all sorts of false gods were invented and idolized. But even false religiosity is a perverse tribute to the real thing. The gods that fail tell us important truths about the God who abides. What distinguishes Dawson's key to history is that, unlike others, it opened doors rather than closed them. He wanted to know, as a theoretical and practical matter, why civilizations destroy themselves. Writing in 1924, for instance, he argued that the Great War showed, quote, how insecure are the foundations on which the elaborate edifice of the modern world order rests. He wanted to rebuild those foundations using sturdier materials than the flimsy liberalism that had been destroyed on the Somme. 21 years later, the challenge was even more severe. And I quote, the totalitarian state is, by its very nature, intolerant not merely of criticism, but of diversity, so that it combines all the intolerances of the past, the intolerance of the absolutist state for the rebel, the intolerance of the orthodox state for the heretic, the intolerance of the police state for the criminal, into a massive weight of social pressure that forces everyone into the same mold of total conformity. Yet, if totalitarianism seemed to make the case for Western liberalism simply by its very horror, could Western liberalism make the case for itself? Well, Dawson, I think, had his doubts. In the past, and to quote Dawson again, in the past, Western civilization was based on the assumption that man had an immortal soul. And however much the state demanded, it admitted, at least in theory, that the destiny of every human being reached beyond the extreme limits of political society, so that human conduct was ultimately governed and judged by super social laws. The secularization of Western society did not immediately destroy the consequences of this belief. I'm still quoting Dawson here. On the contrary, the more men lost their faith in God, the more desperately did they cling to the belief in the liberty and value of human personality, which was the fruit of 1,000 years of Christian culture. The present plight of Western culture, Dawson says, the present plight of Western culture is due to the fact that the real values we are defending against the totalitarian state are values that have been divorced from their religious and metaphysical foundations and are insofar indefensible, but which remain the highest values which we possess. End of quote. As Sigrid Undset remarked, the morality code that remains after the religion that has produced it is rejected is like the perfume that lingers in an empty bottle. The more the West lost its spiritual aim, Dawson thought, the more it clung to its material achievements, little knowing their emptiness. It was in the process of committing suicide while thinking that it was coming back to life. As Chesterton once complained, a great wave of barbarism swept over Western Europe in the 19th century, called the rise of rationalism. It sought to make a man's soul the slave of his body. It did not say that the spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak, the free and generous doctrine of religion. It said that the spirit was unwilling because the flesh was strong. Well, Dawson did not propose as a solution to this crisis the recreation of a vanished Christendom. He proposed instead a politics of engagement with the modern world, a pluralism with deep roots in religious soil. A confessional state was the last thing he wanted, but he did hope for a recovery of the theological foundations upon which a genuine liberalism could be based. Indeed, that commitment was far-reaching, influencing, among others, John Courtney Murray, and through him, the deliberations of the Second Vatican Council. Murray's essay, The Return to Tribalism, seems completely Dawsonian in inspiration. The malady from which our civilization is suffering, Dawson wrote in 1945, can only be remedied by the restoration of the true hierarchy of spiritual ends and by the recognition of the autonomy and irreducibility of the higher levels of spiritual reality. Well, that sentiment prevailed in Rome between 1962 and 1965, and I think it also stands as a summary of Dawson's intellectual project. So, the Dawson revival is not an exercise in nostalgia. He may represent the kind of scholarly life that is all but impossible today. Yet the renewed interest in him says something important about our need for a serious man for serious times. To Professor Stewart, he represents a cultural mind in the age of the Great War, a scholar grappling with civilizational ruin. Those of us who remember the world before the wars, Dawson wrote, recalling his childhood, have witnessed a change in human consciousness far greater than we've realized. And what we're remembering is not the Victorian age, but a whole series of ages, a river of immemorial time which has suddenly dried up and become lost in the seismic cleft that has opened between the present and the past. That change in human consciousness took many forms in the middle years of the 20th century: pessimism, irony, loss of faith. But at its root lay doubt about the very possibility of civilization itself. Dawson knew how slowly accumulated wisdom could be wiped out in an instant. He had seen it before. He was seeing it again. Yet Dawson's project was essentially constructive. As Professor Stewart notices, he sought, quote, to repair the separation of values from truth, religion from culture, ideas from material reality, technology from ecology, past from present, faith from reason, and education from life. That was a formidable program, but by no means an impossible one. After all, Dawson himself had shown how it could be done by thinking clearly, by respecting boundaries, by building bridges, by showing restraint. That is as good a motto as you are likely to get for the Catholic intellectual tradition itself. Being a tradition, it is, of course, alive, a thing handed down, a living legacy, a continuing conversation between past and present. But as with any conversation, there are rules which set the boundaries within which the sayable may be said. In that sense, it is not so much a repository of ideas as a way of looking at the world. It can accommodate many things, but not everything. To be authentically Catholic, it must think with the Church, always recognizing the liberty that comes with limitation. To become a Catholic, Chesterton said, is not to leave off thinking, but to learn how to think. The Catholic convert has, for the first time, this is Chesterton, the Catholic convert has, for the first time, a starting point for straight and strenuous, excuse me, for straight and strenuous thinking. His fellow convert, Christopher Dawson, would surely have agreed. If anyone has modelled for us the straight and strenuous thinking of the tradition, it is that remarkable man that we remember this afternoon. So with those thoughts, I offer the floor to Professor Stewart, whose marvellous monograph I once again commend to you, and I look forward very much to what Professor Stewart will say to us, and then to Professor Bonagura. Joseph.
Great. Thank you, Dermot. Thanks very much for those wonderful words about Dawson. Very reflective and deep. Thank you for them. A wonderful introduction too, to just kind of beginning talking about the Catholic intellectual tradition, Christopher Dawson, how this book came about. It's a work of about 20 years from my undergraduate education, afterward at the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal in Michigan, and then onward through grad school, and then teaching now for almost a decade and a half. And Christopher Dawson sort of infusing the curriculum and the programs here at UMary in a lot of ways. So it's a work of scholarship, but also a work of pedagogical kind of application of Dawson's ideas too. And so I think this idea, I love this title that you've given this webinar, the Christopher Dawson and the Catholic intellectual tradition, because I think Dawson sometimes is not thought of in that tradition. I'm not sure why, but I think it's time to locate him firmly and understand what he contributed. And I think a good place to start considering that is just reflecting briefly on John Henry Newman, who was one of Dawson's just heroes. Newman and Dawson both went to Trinity College, Oxford. Newman was deeply influential in Dawson's conversion from High Anglican to Catholic. And Dawson returns, well, he wrote a book on the Oxford movement, and then later in life, Dawson constantly returned to Newman themes, especially concerning education. And Dawson's kind of last major project was to talk about a renewal of Western and Christian education, and he drew a lot of inspiration from Newman, taking him in some different directions. But I think looking at Newman's idea of the development of doctrine is helpful here, and the idea that the Catholic intellectual tradition is not something static. It develops in dialogue, in engagement with the history and the context around it. Often hardships and the difficulties of the world that you have to suddenly deal with. And the people who develop it and who stretch that Catholic intellectual tradition are sometimes seen as revolutionaries, or maybe not quite revolutionaries, but they're seen as radicals. You know, even someone like Aquinas is seen as somebody, we're not sure about his orthodoxy at the time, right? and then eventually they get folded into the tradition and seen as part of it. Well, something like that here, I think, is that, you know, Newman used the word culture, but he used it in the classical sense of to cultivate the human mind, and maybe also in the artistic sense of high culture and things, but particularly the sense of cultivation. And so the philosophical habit of mind that Newman talked about, it represents sort of a high cultivation of mind, which looks to the whole of reality and locates the different disciplines within that whole. And I guess one of the main arguments that I'm trying to make in this book is that Dawson developed in a way only that Newman could have appreciated and maybe chuckled at Newman's insight. And that happened because of Dawson's engagement with the social sciences, which really gained prominence after Newman, which is precisely the point. The idea of culture itself radically developed from the time of Newman's death through the First World War into the 1920s with the maturation of the fields of anthropology and sociology. Those are the subjects of the first two chapters in my book. Dawson immediately begins seeing the significance of anthropology for understanding history with the great American anthropologists in particular, like Franz Boas in the 19-teens and 20s. And basically the development was this, that culture isn't just singular, it's also plural. That truth is not only just seen from within one culture, it's also seen from within many cultures around the world. Not that it makes it relative, but it means that we view truth from within our cultural contexts. So we can talk about culture as the classics did and as Newman did, but we also need to talk about cultures with an S, plural. The Native American cultures and Japanese cultures and et cetera. And Dawson immediately sees the significance of this. And so he develops this Catholic intellectual tradition by courageously engaging with these modern social sciences and this idea of cultures, when a lot of other Catholic thinkers of the time were either ignoring the social sciences or running away from them because they were dangerous. And it's well known that people left the faith because of anthropology and sociology. You know, the radical sort of relativism apparent within those fields. You know, James Fraser's book, The Golden Bough, for example, played into C.S. Lewis leaving the faith. These kinds of things. Dawson doesn't do that. He doesn't go the direction of other major Catholic figures into literature or the arts or philosophy or theology, as important as those are. He engages with the social sciences, and in doing so works a miracle in a sense, because he's able to show how the diversity of human life and cultures is not a threat to truth or tradition, but is something that broadens it and enriches it. And it has to do with the poetic insight that that truth is seen through particulars, that the world is in a grain of sand idea, and that at the heart of every culture is an intuition of pure being. Aquinas would dance a jig, right, at that. And that's right. You don't have to read Aquinas to know the truths of Aquinas, because the truths of Aquinas are in reality. And reality is experienced and seen from within the cultures of world history. Dawson sees that, and he begins to build his intellectual project on that insight. And he's able to show how the richness of the world cultures and of world history supports deep Christian insights about universality, truth, God, and revelation. It doesn't take away from it. It supports it. And so then he writes his first books, the Age of the Gods in 1928 and Progress in Religion in 1929, and he's able to show how the insights of the world cultures, the weight of religion in world history, as Professor Quinn spoke so eloquently about, show up the positivists and the secularists in the West as they're the ones that need explaining. They're the ones that need to be explained in light of this much broader and truer picture, which is that humanity has, since the beginning, embraced spiritual reality. And not only that, but that spiritual reality has had much to do with human cultural coherence at one time in history and development over time in history. Now, Dawson is fascinated about this because of his context. And this is kind of what I hope is one of the original contributions of my book, which is to let's not just, summarize Dawson's writings. Let's study them in their context. We can understand the questions that he's trying to answer, the implicit questions that are behind his work. And here I'm drawing from a methodology of intellectual history coming from people like R.G. Collingwood in his great autobiography and his logic of question and answer, right, as sort of a responsible, intellectually responsible approach to texts, historically responsible approach to text, right, is that you have a text, an author has written something, but that proposition that author is writing doesn't just free float above time. It's that author is writing it in response to something that's nagging him, something that's bothering her, something that's going on at the time that may not be explicit in the text, may not even be acknowledged, but is implicit if we understand the context around the author. And this for me was the spark that allowed my dissertation and then book to happen, coming from my mentors and saying, well, look, study the context of Dawson, Joseph. Like, duh. Look at the time period that he's working in. I say, oh yeah. So God's providence brought me into league with a scholar of the early 20th century, and particularly of the First World War, and the cultural history of that and the legacy of the First World War as it affected the rest of the 20th century. And so that was the breakthrough for me in research, and then realizing that, yes, the Great War, as it was known at the time, was truly, borrowing the words of Simon Schama, the historian, was truly the original sin of the 20th century. From it came the rise of not communism as an ideology, but the communist regime as a state in Russia, and then quickly afterward, the influence to China, which is still with us to this day. Mussolini emerged out of the trenches into politics. So did Hitler. And so this was the context of Dawson's intellectual maturation during his 20s. This is what's happening. And there's a lot of questions that emerge out of this, particularly ones having to, and Professor Quinn mentioned some of them, but how easy it is for a great and powerful civilization to stumble and fall, and what were the factors in that stumble? What were the factors that led to this fragmentation, this civil war within Western civilization, this breakdown of not just Christian universalism, but even like the universalism of Kant and the age of enlightenment was breaking down. Even that, the secular sense of it was breaking down. Why had this happened? And what can we do to recover a sense of unity of culture? And so Dawson's, his great book, The Making of Europe, was his third book, 1932. The Making of Europe title, and then subtitle, a history of European unity, right? The idea of unity, why was that such a pressing concern? Well, it's because that unity had been fragmented by the Great War and by political ideologies afterward. And so Dawson begins his great intellectual project looking for the relation between religion and cultural unity, and the dangers of when religion is separated from culture, which he saw as an impossible situation, because ultimately creates a vacuum, a spiritual vacuum in which rush these other gods, in a sense, the gods of class in communism, of state in fascism, of race in Nazism, of sort of the people in a kind of a secularist liberalism. These other gods rush into that space, and so the separation of religion and culture is dangerous. But I think Dawson then comes full circle to want to recover, toward his later career, something else Professor Quinn mentioned, which was the liberal tradition. And this may be somewhat controversial. People may have slightly different interpretations of Dawson and his significance for this, but it's definitely relevant to questions today that a lot of Christians and Catholics are asking themselves about the relationship between religion and politics. And I guess I've seen it put, the simplest way, which is the idea that that the separation of church and state is different than the relation between religion and culture. That religion and culture should, in Dawson's view, be intimately connected. But the uniqueness about Christian religion is precisely that relating Christian religion to culture differentiates between church and state, right? The more Christian a society is, I think Dawson would argue, the more differentiated state and church are. And this traced back to, of course, the words of Jesus, of Caesar and God, but also through Christian history and the Christian liberal tradition that emerges first in Spain in the first millennium, but then most prominently in England with the Magna Carta and Parliament and limited government and the rule of law that's passed on to the United States. And so Dawson kind of recovers during World War II an appreciation for that liberal tradition. And this makes him distinct from someone like Belloc and from certain integralist figures today. It makes him distinct, I think, because he saw the importance of this liberal tradition and recovering it and being careful with lauding too much the close relationship of altar and throne, which early modern European history gave us plenty of warnings about. So I think that's the project in a nutshell. Maybe I'll stop there and we can respond to some questions in some different directions that we'd like to go here. But Dawson's cultural mind formed out of his engagement with his context, and then he began to apply it in the fields of politics, as I've just kind of talked about a little bit, and then also in the field of education, which maybe we can circle back to. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, very much. And we will now invite David to talk to us about Christopher Dawson. Thank you very much. David?
Yes, thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Dermot, for inviting me to talk about the man, Christopher Dawson. And it's easy to say with Dawson, just 2 words, Christopher Dawson. And there's a small minority of us, but we get excited when the name Christopher Dawson is invoked. So what I'd like to do today is follow up on what Dermot invited me to contribute to the volume in the Chesterton Review, is my own experience teaching Dawson to a group of high school seniors, 9 of them, in a brief trimester-long course that ran from the end of February to the middle of May. And I put Dawson in the context of a course that I entitled Progress, Religion, and Secularization in the West. So I presented this as a thesis that, and Joseph was alluding to the impact of the Great War on Dawson's thinking and on so many others. My thesis was that the world in which we live 100 years after the Great War is not all that much different philosophically and theologically, culturally speaking, than the world Dawson inhabited 100 years ago. That we still live, in a sense, in the aftermath of the Great War and trying to come to grips with its significance, what it means for us as human beings and as a culture. Put that in the context of today, where students grow up in a world as if God doesn't exist, as Joseph Ratzinger and others have used the term. They go to school in a world where their education is oriented not toward pursuing truth, but for achieving credentials so that they can move up the social ladder. Their leisure time is spent entirely in secular, worldly pursuits. And religion is just not a prominent thing in the lives of so many people. And we, of course, have all the data to back that up. So to take a Dawsonian thesis, to say to a bunch of kids, whether it be high school kids, college kids, or even adults these days, and say, religion is the key to history, religion is the key to culture, they might look at us like we have multiple heads. Really? A religion, the thing you do for an hour on Sunday? Maybe if you feel like it, maybe if you have nothing else to do. That thing is the key to history. That's what shapes our whole world. That's the entirety of Dawson's project, or at least the soul of Dawson's project. And it's foreign to us today. Yet if we dig into this, as Joseph was mentioning, we find today that there are other religions, lowercase r, who have filled the vacuum of what the Christian religion has done for the West for so many centuries up to this point. So I put together this course, again, Progress, Religion, and Secularization in the West, with the goal of simply opening students to the idea that religion, any religion, even if the religion is, say, liberalism or expressive individualism, communism, socialism, whatever that religion may be, is what shapes culture and shapes history. And I did that in a couple of ways. We started with reading about progress. Students know progress in the sense of, okay, I get a new iPhone every few years. It's updated. I can get a fancier camera, things like that. Well, there's more to progress than that. What does progress mean on a philosophical level? And how do we view it both positively and negatively. And I took actually selections from Joseph's book on Dawson for the reading of that. Then we looked at and spent 3 class periods reading The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. They liked it. And sadly, they hadn't read it before being 18 years old, 2 years in high school, and they hadn't yet read The Wasteland. But they saw, we read The Wasteland in this context of saying that this is the land after the war. Where is hope? Where is meaning for Eliot and for the people whom Eliot describes in the poem? And they saw that without some sort of religion, without some sort of greater vision beyond the secular horizon, the horizontal horizon, there is a wasteland, that there's nowhere to look for hope, for movement, for meaning. And that was impactful. But by far the most impactful part of the course, which brings us back to Dawson, was reading Progress and Religion, myself and 9 students in seminar format. We divided each of the chapters, almost all the chapters, into 2 halves. So we spent they said read about 9 or 10 pages of text per class. And it was after the third class that I realized just how impactful this Dawson's work was. Because when I asked them to write their first, it was a senior 3rd term, so we went easy on them. Simply a reflection paper, reaction paper, respond to anything that we've discussed in class or you've read and tell me what you think about it. Just a week after finishing The Wasteland, no one wrote about The Wasteland. They all wrote about the beginning pages of Progress and Religion. And I said, wow, if we're going to put T.S. Eliot to the side in favor of Dawson, Dawson is doing something here. Well, what is Dawson doing? And they wrestled with Dawson. They thought it was hard. And Dawson is not easy sledding for even the accomplished reader. But I think that was the charm for them, that they saw that this guy was clearly learned, that he could write with such impact and power and pack so much into just a single sentence that he being Dawson, immediately commanded their respect. They even if they didn't agree with some of the things he had to say, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about. I'm at least gonna give it a listen. And that's what they did. And they wrestled with it. And I would encourage anyone who's listening, who's a teacher of any capacity, particularly a history teacher, to give some selections of Dawson to your students to read, even if you just spend a class on, run off, Xerox some copies of, you could take another book. Let's say, here's take a standard. Dawson was not a fan of the traditionally way that we in education these days divide our history studies into, say, early modern and modern European history, or the way we do it now is a European history and an American history. That wasn't his preferred way of doing business. Nevertheless, if we are doing business in that way, Progress and Religion is one. Maybe that's a little bit heavy the way it's organized, but his Crisis of Western Education book, the first 2 or 3 chapters give a very brief outline of history from the Greeks up through the modern age. And a teacher can Xerox that, pass that on to the students, and say, here, having finished a unit on early modern European history, for the transition from the Renaissance to the early modern period, read Dawson on that. It's only a few pages long. It's got so much in it, and let the kids grapple with his conclusions, none of which, of course, are typical Dawsonian style, none of which are adorned with footnotes. So you're left with dealing with Dawson's own theses on the matter and saying, what do I mean about this? But contrast what he has to say to what is in the standard textbook and the standard presentation of how the Renaissance was this man is the measure of all things and this slow rejection of God. Dawson has a different way of explaining these things, and a cogent way that I think appeals to students, particularly those of an acquisitive mind. So if we're, to go briefly down a tangent on another road, though, another topic, if we're concerned about our students and whether or not we're really engaging them in school these days, throw a Dawson essay at them and see what they do. Let them grapple with Dawson. As I said to Dermot yesterday, my favorite teacher from high school who introduced me to Dawson put it this way. He's talking about other great books of Aristotle and Plato and such. He said, well, I know that these students don't quite understand these books. And you know that these students don't quite understand these books. But the students don't know that they don't understand these books. So let them have a chance to read them and think about them. And in that in the action of thinking, they'll get so much more out of it than they will by simply reading the standard textbook edition of whatever it is, the period of history that they're reading. So to return to progress and religion, which is our main theme for the course, it traces the arc of history, the development of history from ancient times, to how religion came to shape those cultures, including the Hebrew culture, including the nascent Christian culture, and then bringing it into our own age, into the modern age. So they're wrestling with these issues that today, the standard presentation, especially if students go to a public school where they're not even allowed to mention God in class, the standard presentation is that God is, religion is done. It's not something that's meaningful and impactful. It doesn't have anything to do with culture. They think culture is just, pop culture or something like that, not the way that people live. And in our discussions, we used Joseph's breakdown of how to understand Dawson, the handy acronym, and maybe Joseph can speak about more of this later if we have time. The IFWP, that culture defined in the Dawsonian system, not so much as something cultivated, but it just is the common way that people live. Culture is shaped by four things. The I is the idea. And in almost every civilization, that's the primary religion that's shaping and driving that culture. The F is, then there's a little vertical line there. And so that's the intellectual, the abstract, if you will. Then there's three concrete things. These are the ones that sociologists and anthropologists tend to pay attention to, not really so much paying attention to the idea/religion side. That's F for folk, the people, who these people are. Why are the Celts different from the Germans, and why are the Germans different from the Italians, and so on? Then you have W, the work, what it is that the people do, basically shaped by their environment that makes them different from any other group or the group next door to them. And then finally, P is the place, the geography, how geography shapes a people and a culture. And these four dynamic factors influence each other, not in a necessarily a linear way, but the change of one can bring a change in the other three, a development, a growth, or even a retraction. Some sort of even a death of culture could come about through any change in any of these four things. So we talked about that. And one of the techniques I used for our discussions was one I learned from my aforementioned mentor, Mr. Connolly, was to remove myself from the conversation. I gave them 10, 15, or even 20 minutes, whereas I will not speak. It's on you. They were sat in a circle, and they had the opportunity to discuss, to ask questions. Doing so, again, gave them the opportunity to think, that famous Socratic method of teaching, gave them a way to discuss these ideas without having them shaped by me or intermediated by me in any way. They were able to gain so much more out of it. At the end of the essay in the Chesterton Review, I'd like to read just a couple paragraphs from an outstanding essay of a student who took the course just because he was generally interested in the title, not overly religious in orientation, very much worldly in his outlook. He's now a student at an Ivy League university, and he was arguably one of the top students in the school. So this is a superb essay by a superb student, certainly not the norm, but nevertheless, it's worth hearing the impact that Dawson had on him. So I'll read 2 paragraphs briefly from him. I find myself returning to the solutions we may pose to Dawson's great societal diagnosis. We have secularized, with our culture and civilization withering without its foundational religious tenets. We ask ourselves how to get out of T.S. Eliot's wasteland, return to a time in which religious foundations provided constancy and continuity for a society in progress. Simultaneously, I am conflicted by any nostalgia of the past, as I cannot dismiss the progress of our country in civil rights, technological and material advancement. Whether these strides happen in spite of or because of secularization, I cannot quite say. But I am drawn to the idea of a better age of American civilization, in which continual material progression of human life complements a repair of the human soul. I do not know what can be done to bring this better world about. How this reanimation of the American spirit will take place is a matter of conjecture. I think the most likely path, however, is the one I took over the course of this class. I wanted to study secularization because I thought it was an interesting concept of which I knew little, though intuitively I was in favor of a less religious society. Over time, I understood that the decay that happens when a people lack a life force, a connection to something bigger than themselves, a true meaning. It was a sickness I saw in myself and in the world around me. I believe that somewhere along the line exists a moment of critical mass in which enough people will consciously recognize our own cultural and religious failings and choose to desecularize in a way similar to myself. The only path forward begins with national self-reflection. When that begins, I do not know, but I wait in earnest for that day. Dawson, win. And what a powerful reflection on what he has to say, on just Dawson's impact to his thinking. That again, just by slugging away, it wasn't something that he saw, after a week or two of the course, but by the end, Dawson opened a whole world for this student, a world that he wasn't open to, wasn't even aware of before he sat down and read Dawson. So Dawson, as contributing to the Catholic intellectual tradition, talk about passing the torch to opening a whole new generation to these ideas of the essential aspect of religion, and particularly the God of the Bible, and what he has to say he has to do, his impact in shaping the world in which we live. And conversely, if we take God out of the equation, how that in turn shapes the world in which we live. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dawson and to Dermot, to Gloria, for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for that great presentation and for reading those couple of paragraphs. We have received a couple of questions through email, and I would like to post them. They're not really directed to anybody in particular, so I will. We have about 4 of them at the moment. The first one is, I guess this will be a short answer for each one of you. How did you become interested in Dawson? Dermot?
Okay, well, that's a good question, Gloria. I suppose the answer to it is very simple. Is fairly simple. That I mean, you can't really be involved in the Chesterton world and in the world of Chestertonians without immediately coming in touch with Dawson. As Joseph kind of indicated, we have this kind of extraordinary revival of interest in things Catholic in England in the middle years of the 20th century. And in fact, Adam Schwartz, who wrote for the Review and has written brilliantly on other matters, deals with this this English Catholic revival. Adam, I think, was with us, maybe still is with us in the conversation. So I think the first way I'd answer the question is that you can't really be a Chestertonian and not come in touch or come in contact with Dawson. And Joseph alluded to Dawson's enormous debt to Newman, and I acknowledge a debt to Newman myself, a spiritual debt and a historical debt, and I suppose in a way a kind of a professional debt, which is that the first book that I wrote was on English Catholics and politics in the second half of the 19th century. So Newman certainly appears in that, maybe as a bit of a walk-on part, but he's there nonetheless. So I mean, I have that interest in Newman, and from that I certainly developed an interest in Dawson. But I think it was primarily my dealings with Chesterton and the Chesterton world. And as Joseph kind of indicates, this was not a unanimously kind of cheerful and altogether sort of in shared agreement sort of a world. There were tensions in that English Catholic world, and Dawson represents one kind of view of one kind of view of the Catholic intellectual tradition, actually, and Chesterton in some respects represents another. And certainly, as Joseph pointed out, you can see in the kind of the Belloc Chesterton relationship, a degree of tension, a degree of coming from the world at somewhat different angles. That kind of view that Europe is the church and the church is Europe. Well, I think in some ways Dawson would part company with that somewhat triumphalist view. So how did I come to Dawson? Through my connection with Chesterton and the Chesterton world, through my attachment to Newman, and then just finally, perhaps, I got to know a man to whom I haven't paid tribute, but I should pay tribute, and that is Edward King, who did a great deal of hard and I think unthanked work in this Dawson revival. Edward King was a sort of successor, if you like, to John Malloy, and he kept the kind of the Dawson flame alit for a number of years. So I knew Edward King, and Edward was a kind of well, he was a man to whom I must pay tribute, and he certainly introduced me to elements of Dawson that I wasn't myself aware of, so that's broadly my answer to the question. But Joseph, how about you?
Great. So for me, it was my undergraduate education at the Franciscan University of Steubenville with my great mentor there, Professor James Gaston, who started the Dawson revival along with others in the early 90s with the new program there called Humanities and Catholic Culture. And still a great friend of mine. And David spoke about the IFWP and how, that for me, that was so powerful. The idea of culture as a common way of life made up of these 4 different elements: ideas, folkways, workways, and placeways. And seeing in history how they influence each other was so fascinating. It brought so much together into a unity to understand that I just wanted to find out more about it. And so that led to, okay, so where did this IFWP come from? And so discovering, okay, so Dawson is drawing out of these kind of strange figures of British sociology in the 19-teens and 20s, and they were talking about the FWP culture as sort of a material organization of life, and Dawson's like, yeah, this is it, but wait, you're missing an element here, right? And so Dawson kind of draws their material culture from them, their powerful insights, and sort of unites them to religion and the intellectual factor. And that's really Dawson's like innovation, is to bring the I together with the FWP. And then the way he writes about it in Progress and Religion as just like the human mind and soul are consubstantial with the body of the human being, so too in culture, which are made up of human beings, is the intellectual and spiritual element of culture consubstantial with the body of culture, the material culture. And we need to bring those together. And most cultural theorists ever since, up until this very day, split them. They focus more on the intellectual side of culture, or else they focus on just sort of material culture. And it's the rare mind that's bringing both of those together, those dimensions. And Dawson.
I think I don't know. I think we have almost lost Joseph. Okay.
Here.
You
Sorry,
froze
Joseph,
there
go
for a
ahead.
moment.
We lost you for a second. Maybe you could
We
just
lost you
repeat.
for a second.
Yeah, and so. Oh.
We lost you again.
Okay.
We lost you again. So maybe we'll wait until maybe your system resets. Yeah. And then David,
okay.
How about you?
I came to meet Dawson through the influence of my teacher, Mr. John Connolly, who I mentioned before, and he was actually the mutual teacher of a mutual friend of mine and of Dermot's, and that's Gerald Russello, who sadly passed away too early in November of 2021. Gerald was a great friend of mine, longtime editor of the University Bookman. And in 1998, he produced a new volume of Dawson essays under the title Christianity and European Culture. And he wrote a splendid introduction to that. And through Gerald, that was my first interaction with Dawson. My first reading of Dawson was the essays that are in that volume. And that was early. So many of Dawson's works have been reproduced by CUA Press over the last bunch of years. Gerald's volume from 1998 came out before all those. And in some ways, I think it's not overstating the case to say that he catalyzed a bit of a Dawson publishing renewal in putting out in the success of that work. It's 1998. It's still in print, and there's one long essay at the beginning of, I don't remember what it is, and a number of Dawson's shorter works. And I remember once asking him, I used an essay with high school kids several years ago. I said, Joe, what's the essay? If I'm going to pick one essay from your volume to read with high school kids, what should it be? And he had it at the ready. So it was through Gerald's ongoing influence now from the other side of eternity, where I got to meet Dawson, and I would like to say that Gerald's still working, trying to move the ways of Dawson from the other side with the Lord.
Thank you very much, David. I have a question for you as well that has come out. In teaching the class, did the topic of secularization within the Catholic Church come up at all? In addition to examining secularization in the external a-religious world, did a discussion of the Church's own participation in worldly matters arise, especially post-Vatican II arise?
No, we kept most of our conversation to the World War I era and thereafter, and speaking more about cultural in general rather than the specific issues of the church. I think you make the claim that, and this would be my own opinion here, that some of the secularization that or what we call just the loss of fervor in the church after the council is probably the result of some of those cultural ideas from the aftermath of the Great War being adopted by a number of people who were in the church, whether it be bishops or pastors or other people involved in parish life. And that sort of stuff took hold, and it's really of Catholic schools, like probably foremost. That worldview took hold in a way that probably wasn't helpful for the development of the faith in the current generations. And I think we have the statistics of the nuns to back up that thesis, is that the passing on of religion was damaged by the adopting of some of these secular ideas that were brought into the church. But we did not spend our time focusing on the emphasis of, or how that impacted the church herself, rather just on the culture more broadly.
Thank you. We have another question, maybe this one for Joseph. Why did Dawson become interested in history?
Well, he was born in a 12th century castle on the border with Wales, and so it was it was bred into him in a sense. His mother was Welsh and a scholar of Welsh literature and history and saints. And his father was a military man, but also just had a huge library and would just reading all the time. So he grew up in a house stuffed with books. He would be delighted to know that the castle he was born in Hay-on-Wye on the border with Wales is now a used bookstore. He would be delighted to know that. And I think he was just impressed with the way that I think both of you alluded to this in your opening statements, the way that religion is sort of brooded over the landscape of England, whether at his school at Winchester or at Oxford or at the great ruined abbeys of Yorkshire where he grew up later in life. He was just impressed by that, and that attraction, I think, to the past drew him into it. But I think the key transition point for his life and his love of the study of history and his mission actually happened in Rome. Where he went with his friend E.I. Watkin, who was a Catholic, and Dawson was still Anglican. He went to Rome at Easter in 1909, and it changed his life. He realized the power and the beauty of Catholic Baroque culture, and that that the Catholic Church wasn't just something like sort of that existed in the Middle Ages, but had continued to exist in his present. And he began to ask questions about how did Christianity transform ancient pagan culture when you're surrounded by churches that the stones and columns of those churches, like Aracelli, the church above the Roman Forum, are built out of the Roman stones, literally out of the pagan temples that have been refounded as Christian temples. He became fascinated with how does the eye of a culture shift, and how does that then shape the rest of the culture over the next generations, right? And so he wrote in his diary that he was resolved that it was God's will he should attempt to write the history of culture, and that was a resolve that he made even before his conversion to Catholicism.
Thank you, Joseph. We have another question that I don't know who would like to take it. Is What was new about Dawson's approach to history? The floor is yours.
Well, that's such a good question, actually, Gloria. And I think in some ways, Joseph alluded to the answer, sort of hinted at an answer in his own remarks, and that is that I think with Dawson there was this kind of impatience at the inadequacy with which history was being done at a professional level. In the age in which he was coming of age, and indeed in the whole of the 19th century. I mean, there's a wonderful passage, actually, I kind of scribbled it out here, in The Age of the Gods. Here's what he says. He says, during the last 2 centuries, the history of Europe has been given an almost exclusively national interpretation. History has often sunk to the level of political propaganda, and even some of the greatest historians of the 19th century, Macaulay, Froude, even Mommsen himself, have been unashamed political partisans. So he said, I have come of age, he said, in an age in which, at a time in which history has been basically abused as an instrument of political propaganda and of national propaganda and so on. And the greatest historians seem to think that that is the task of the historian, to, so to speak, give ammunition for our side. And as Joseph indicated to us, this is an extraordinarily sort of shallow, uncritical, unreflective view of the past. Because for one thing, it obviously leaves out all of the insights that we can glean from social anthropology and other intellectual disciplines. So Dawson came to history to answer the question, Gloria. What was new about Dawson's approach is that openness to the intellectual insights of other disciplines, which Joseph so brilliantly points out. He was then able to sort of recognize as specific to those disciplines, but also capable of cross-fertilization with other disciplines, as opposed to the very thin, unreflective, partisan way in which history was being done up until that point. So I think that is a very brief way of sort of indicating that there was something new about the way in which Dawson was doing history. I don't know whether Joseph or David would like to sort of build on that.
Yeah, I want to add a couple of thoughts there. That's good, and not only thin, Dermot, but dangerous, this nationalist interpretation. And this is why Dawson, emerging out of the First World War, begins to rethink the basis for history. And what's interesting is to see it in comparison with other historians who are also rethinking history right after the First World War. Somebody like Arnold Toynbee also comes out of the First World War in England, and he realizes like national history is dangerous. Like, be careful with it. Let's rethink it. Let's begin to think about history in a global sense, a world history. And so that becomes his life project. And then in France, you have people like Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre who are starting, who come out of the First World War. They meet at the University of Strasbourg with other friends in sociology and psychology and things, and they begin to formulate a new interdisciplinary approach to history called the Annales School that was developing in France just as Dawson was developing his own interdisciplinary history in England. So you can see that there was a need for a new thinking of history that was either based on world history or civilization, or in Dawson's case, culture, and we need to rethink it and move forward on that basis.
David, any comments on your end?
No, I think I'll yield to the professional historians on this one.
Okay.
They nailed it.
Okay, we have a final question for each one of you. Do you have a favorite Dawson book? Let's start with David.
My favorite Dawson book is The Crisis of Western Education, which is one he wrote later in his career. And I mentioned it when I was speaking earlier. It's interesting on a couple levels because it's a very sweeping and broad history of the Greeks up until modern times. And I can't remember now if it's Dawson or others who have said that because education, the mission of education, contrary to popular belief, is to pass on a culture. a history of education is in fact a history of a culture and of civilization, because you're studying what it is that makes the culture, makes people unique and special. So he speaks about that, and then delves into the way education has been since the Greeks up until the modern times, and then gets into some particular questions about the nature of education. It's a splendid read. He's got a lot in there. And I would submit that that's a good book to start with for Dawson, because you get a bit of the history and then his sense for how he does history, but also you get a sense for a whole new topic, as Joseph mentioned earlier, is that was near and dear to his heart in the latter couple of decades of his life. And so many of and I know Joseph teaches at the University of Mary, where these Catholic studies programs that have popped up in different universities across the country are really, you could call them Dawsonian inspired studies, if you would like. Catholic studies is a better name for them, certainly, but the methodology for doing Catholic studies comes directly from Dawson's playbook. And I would submit that The Crisis of Western Education shows a little bit of how Dawson goes about doing that business.
Thank you, David. How about Joseph?
Sure, I want to reaffirm what David said, because yeah, that book, Crisis of Western Education, is not only amazing, it's also highly influential because of Catholic studies programs across the country, but even beyond, in places like Campion College in Australia, where there's also a Dawson revival happening there. And so, Dermot talked about at the beginning of this event, about the relevance of Dawson. Well, I mean, he's influencing the way we're educating our young people at universities and with David at an excellent high school. This is an amazing thing. There's just very few historians whose books are still published and read 50 to 60 years after they've passed away. There's very few who could have that claim. So I love that book too. But if I'm pushed on it, I think I would probably go with Progress in Religion, which is a book that has been with me ever since I was 19 years old, and I just love it in the way that Dawson is looking at the development of world history in such a succinct and profound way, with the respect for research and the historical and anthropological details, combined with just kind of a philosophical profundity that is woven throughout it, that is just amazing and inspiring to behold. So I would go with that one.
Okay, Dermot Quinn.
Well,
how about you?
What an interesting question. I mean, there are so many books to choose from, and the books that David and Joseph have mentioned are absolutely wonderful books. I would offer two. One which is in the tradition of Progress and Religion would be The Age of the Gods, which is really an extraordinary book, because what you see here is, first of all, Dawson's absolutely compendious erudition. I mean, this is an extraordinary work of scholarship, of the recovery of extremely distant civilizations or cultures. So The Age of the Gods has that kind of scholarly sort of heft. But it's also, as Joseph was saying, it's borne aloft by a kind of philosophy of history or a philosophy of culture, so that it's never simply accumulated details of earlier cultures and civilizations. Implicit in it is a philosophy of history. So I would say The Age of the Gods. I offer that actually in a slightly selfish way, and that's because I wrote an introduction to it. So if you want to get your hands on it, then I would be delighted. Another book that I would mention, and this kind of hints at what Joseph was saying in his earlier remarks, is a lovely little book called The Spirit of the Oxford Movement, which is a slight book. It's not a big book, but it, so to speak, repays that debt that Dawson certainly owed to the Oxford Movement and to Newman. There has been a fairly recent reissuing of The Spirit of the Oxford Movement, with an introduction by Peter Nockels, who actually came to Seton Hall a few years ago and was part of our Chesterton community for a little while. So I would offer The Age of the Gods and The Spirit of the Oxford Movement And maybe just as if I could be allowed, one final book, that would be Understanding Europe, which I think is Dawson at his most readable. I mean, I don't say that the other books aren't readable, but there's a kind of wonderful fluency and readability and kind of aphoristic quality to Understanding Europe, which I would think people would find very, very compelling. And for example, I'm sure David's students could kind of seize on a book like that and say, there's something here which speaks to our time, and it speaks very accessibly to our time. So those are my three: The Age of the Gods, The Spirit of the Oxford Movement, and Understanding Europe.
Thank you very much, all of you. I think that with this great comments and conversation, we're almost reaching the end of our program. On behalf of the Chesterton Institute, I would like to thank our speakers. I think someone has another question has just come. Give me 1 second. I know Dawson tried to start a kind of movement community called Sword and the Spirit. Do you know what he was trying to propose to people in a practical sense to help our secular situation today? And what is in the publication? And if that is in publication still? So we'll address this question and then we'll go back to our closing.
Sure, I can speak to that. Yeah, this was the Sword of the Spirit movement during the Second World War in Britain. It's not a title of a book. It's the name of a movement that Cardinal Hinsley in London asked Dawson to help start as vice president, along with some other leading figures. And the purpose was to kind of spiritually and intellectually arm Christians at the beginning of the Second World War, when it was recognized that there was a major danger looming across the English Channel in the form of Nazism, which had just conquered most of France in a couple of weeks. And it was unknown what was going to happen next. And so, partly a lot of a legacy of the First World War, when a lot of bishops had really sort of celebrated the war effort, a lot of Anglican bishops distanced themselves from the war effort in the Second World War. And so it was actually the Catholics who were kind of taking the Christian lead in England during the Second World War to kind of unite people in an ecumenical way, both Protestants and Catholics, behind the government effort to resist Hitler. And Dawson's contribution was to write many tracts and essays and things, which have been republished, and sometimes they're hard to find, but some of them have been republished in other formats, but to kind of educate people on what's going on, and a lot of the themes that David talked about earlier about, sort of the loss of religion, secularization, the new religions coming in, the secular religions, and how to kind of resist those, and how to sort of rebuild, resist Nazism, and then at the same time rebuild England during and after the war, without embracing the ideas of totalitarianism itself, right? In other words, resist totalitarianism without becoming totalitarian. And that is an inward battle as much as it is an outward battle, and that was the purpose of that movement.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And once again, on closing, I would like to thank the three of you, our speakers, for the great presentations and very engaging conversation. I also would like to thank our attendees for joining us today and for the interest that they have in our work. Just for everyone to know, in the next few days, we will send out a notice with a link to the video recording to this presentation that will be housed on our YouTube channel, so you will be able to access and share it as many times as you would like. Also, if you would like to continue to be in our mailing list, or if you would like to share with someone, please have them write to us at Chesterton Institute at shu.edu. And as mentioned by Dermot Quinn, a little commercial, our last issue, fall winter 2023, was a special Christopher Dawson issue. If you would like to obtain a copy or subscribe or give a gift subscription, please again write to us and we will arrange for you to to have what you need. But if you're not a subscriber yet, please consider to do that. And this way you can also continue to help us with the next 50 years. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Institute and the review. And yeah, it's a great accomplishment. And it also one that honors Father Boyd, who, as most of you have known, he has sadly very recently passed away. So we stand on big shoulders, and your support and continued attendance and reading of the review, that's how we can look into the next 50 years. So I thank you for that. And we will be sending more information for our upcoming events. And once again, thank you, and we'll see you the next time. Bye-bye.